civil rights movement in the United States has a long history. In 1865, slavery is officially abolished.
In 1866, the Civil Rights Act outlawed black codes.
In 1868, the 14th Amendment grants African Americans full citizenship rights.
In 1870, the 15th Amendment gives blacks full suffrage.
But in 1876, Jim Crow laws began to deny rights to Southern blacks.
And in 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson declares segregation legal.
From 1941 to 1945, African Americans served bravely in World War II, both home and abroad.
And in 1948, Truman fully integrated the military.
The stage is set to challenge the legality of the clause of separate but equal in America.
You can never whip these birds if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
Ever since Plessy v. Ferguson, Southern states fiercely enforced segregation. Jim Crow laws forbade interracial marriages and outlawed informal contact between the races. There were separate schools, bus seats, water fountains, and restrooms. Black facilities were always inferior to white facilities, and they were labeled with humiliating signs. Some forms of informal segregation existed in northern cities as well. Blacks could find housing in all-black neighborhoods only and faced hatred on the job front. Even pro sports were segregated until 1948 when Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier with the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Aggressive direct action was needed to wipe away segregation forever. The NAACP had fought against segregation since 1909, but now they looked to take legal action against the Jim Crow South. Their legal strategy was to sue over the inequality in the educational system, which leads to the court case Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. Segregation is also challenged in public transportation throughout the South. This leads to the Montgomery bus boycott.
The success in Montgomery and Little Rock led to the spread of the movement. Advocates of civil rights saw hope that things could actually change. Young people and white Americans joined the movement. New groups formed and used King's Soul Force strategy to protest. So let's take a look at these new groups that formed during the civil rights movement. The first group is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC. It was formed in 1957. It was made up of African American ministers and aimed to use churches as bases to organize protests. Another group was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, and it was formed in 1960. It was made up of college students, both black and white, who pledged peaceful protest. SNCC famously staged sit-ins at segregated lunch counters and were willing to be arrested in order to get their point across. 1961. The civil rights movement was gearing up for bold action. Civil rights groups, such as SNCC, the SCLC, CORE, and the NAACP, planned big campaigns in the South. These campaigns aimed to provoke action and draw attention to the cause. Hopefully, the media coverage would force Kennedy to act on civil rights. And these campaigns start with the Freedom Riders. In 1961, CORE sent young black and white activists on buses to the South. The idea was to challenge segregation laws on buses in southern states. In Alabama, state officials promised JFK that they would protect the riders, but they lied, and mobs firebombed the buses and beat the passengers severely. Shortly after JFK's death, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in his memory. This law is monumental in the struggle for equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did several things. The first thing it did was it banned discrimination based on race in employment nationwide. Employers could no longer use race as a factor when hiring. Second, it enhanced the federal power to enforce desegregation in schools and in public services. This provision on non-discrimination in the workforce is still used today for women and minorities. The moderate leaders continued to preach nonviolence to achieve equality. The next phase of the movement was to protest voting rights. Determined to show nonviolence could work, Martin Luther King planned a march. MLK and other moderates descended on Selma, Alabama, which leads to the Freedom Summer and the Selma Campaign. In 1964, SNCC began a 2-year voter registration campaign in Mississippi. This Freedom Summer had college kids signing up poor blacks to vote. Some volunteers were beaten by angry whites, and some were killed. In 1965, MLK and the SCLC staged a march in Selma in support of voting rights. Like Birmingham, the campaign was attacked by whites who beat marchers. The scenes that people saw during this march led Americans to call for new laws now in order to provide equality for African Americans.
With President Lyndon Baines Johnson in office, instituting his Great Society programs, the civil rights movement achieves several successes. The first is the 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which officially declared that poll taxes, making voters pay in order to vote, was illegal. This struck down several southern state laws keeping African Americans from voting. Another was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This law made voter literacy tests illegal and allowed federal agents to travel to southern states to ensure that African Americans could register to vote and not be intimidated by violence. The last was the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This law outlawed racial discrimination when it came to housing. You couldn't deny an African American family the right to buy a home if they were good buyers.